Shalom and welcome to Tov, the Jewish news channel. We have with us today Ziv Maor, who is an attorney here in Israel and a commentator on this channel and on various other channels. Ziv, I'd like to ask you about what you think the possible solutions are for the day after the war in Gaza. What do you think? What are the possibilities? How can the situation look at that time?
So, first of all, the gravity of this question needs to be assessed and understood. This is the question. This is the aim toward which we march when we fight. I mean, the idea or the destination that the government set it in the beginning of the war to annihilate Hamas's control in the Gaza Strip, this is not a positive definition. It says what the Israeli government expects that will not happen in Gaza after the war. We're discussing what should happen. And the fact that the Israeli government doesn't have a positive answer to this question is very troubling at this point. What is the destination? Now, when the Israeli government will set such a destination, it doesn't necessarily mean that if this destination will not be achieved, this is a loss in the war. This is not the case. But we have to set a destination and march toward this destination and achieve as much as possible on the way there. Now, there are several premises that needs to be understood when discussing this issue, and several examples from history that we need to discuss about the topic. First and foremost, the civil administration of the Gaza Strip at the moment is managed by UNRWA. UNRWA is an illegitimate organization. I will mention just diving a bit into the history of this organization. UNRWA was founded several months before the UNHCR, the United Nations High Committee about Refugees. And this was a coincidence. It was not this way by design. The issue of the Arab refugees from the land of Israel after the 1948 war was so much burning in the UN at the time, so they rushed toward establishing an organization. At the time in Geneva, there was discussions about founding a different organization that will tackle the issue of refugees abroad. So this is how we came with two refugees organizations under the umbrella of the UN. One about the Palestinian refugees, which gives them a special status that can be inherited to their descendants in a manner that does not exist anywhere else, and another one to all of the other refugees in the world. And the UNHCR is doing quite a good job in addressing the issue of refugees. UNRWA, on the other hand, its main target is eternalizing the conflict between Israel and the Arabs. Israel should say...
In other words, one agency of the United Nations for all refugees except Palestinians works to end their refugee status. In other words, find them a permanent place to live. And UNRWA, on the other hand, its sole objective is to perpetuate the refugee status of the Palestinians forever and forever.
Exactly. Now, this constitutes a stance for Israel to stand upon and say UNRWA is not a legitimate organization. Now, the fact is that the civil administration of the Gaza Strip in the past few decades is managed by UNRWA. What should be stipulated on behalf of Israel about the day after is that another body, which is not UNRWA, will take over the civil infrastructure that UNRWA facilitated in the past few decades, and through it would provide the Arabs that will remain in the Gaza Strip the civil services and the civil administration. So we have a skeleton, we have an infrastructure. It needs to be taken away from an illegitimate organization that, by the way, infringed its charter. Okay, so when we hear, for instance, in the IDF spokesman notification from today that there was some military equipment that was found in a school in Jabalia, this is an UNRWA school. This means that UNRWA violates its charter as provider of civil services for the people of Gaza, and instead they give shelter for military causes within the Gaza Strip. Under these circumstances, Israel has every right to say to the world, UNRWA, yok, no more UNRWA, we'll give it to another entity. Now, what will this entity look like? We can draw inspiration from the mandate regime in the Middle East that was founded exactly 100 years ago, or 101, 1922, in the Ziv Maor Accords, that decided to divide the Middle East between a French mandate and a British mandate. The premise for this policy was that the polities of the area at the time were not mature enough to develop their own political institution.
So how can Israel make sure that the new UNRWA, the replacement UNRWA, doesn't become the old UNRWA, that it isn't taken over by Hamas again?
So the best way to ensure this is to understand the incentives of the various options, of the various entities that are candidates for this position. So obviously the purest incentive is that of Israel, but Israel on its own will probably not gain enough trust from the rest of the world to get to her sole control this mandate. I believe that this mandate should be divided between Israel, the United States, and the United Arab Emirates. If you look at the incentives of these three entities and the projection of their incentive about what should happen in Gaza, you get quite an interesting balance. The presence of the UAE in this context serves two purposes. First of all, the UAE is the most prominent Arab player in the anti-Iranian axis in the Middle East, and the UAE should be rewarded for its unique position, giving the UAE a charter that acknowledges its status as, I wouldn't say a superpower, but a relative power in the Middle East, is something that I believe that the UAE will not only take upon itself, but also reward the entities that gave it to her. Another important thing to understand about the role of the UAE over here is that, according to Islam itself, it is much more legitimate for the Muslims of Gaza. I'm putting aside their national pseudo-identity as Palestinian, which is irrelevant in my eyes. As Muslims, it will be very problematic for them to be controlled by non-Muslims, by infidels. If you put in an entity that is on one hand trustworthy and on the other hand is Muslim, then the tendency of the people that will remain in Gaza to accept this administration will be much higher. So I'm talking about trifecta protectorate of Israel, the United States, and the UAE. I believe that this should be the entity that will take over the administrative aspect of the civil service in Gaza after the war. It goes without saying that when it comes to defense and military and security, there is only one entity that is reliable enough to guard the security of the Jews, and this is the state of Israel. Everything in the aspect of domestic and external security should be treated and taken care of by the Israeli military, both as a civil guardian of the area, internal policing, and security defense against terrorism.
That's a very interesting suggestion. In wake of the Abraham Accords, I also thought that the UAE and the other countries in the Gulf that have made peace with Israel in the context of the Abraham Accords could provide a different role model for Israeli Arabs as well, and certainly for Gazans and other Arabs in Judea and Samaria, for how to relate to the state of Israel in their midst. And certainly different from the Muslim Brotherhood, which is actually seeking not a state for Palestine, but rather to take over the world. And we're just the first step.
I've heard from Mordechai Kedar, who is a very known scholar about Islam and about the Arab world here in Israel. I interviewed him to another platform a few months back, and he said something very interesting. He said that the Abraham Accords gave a role model for Israeli Arabs and gave him the understanding, which is far from intuitive for people who live here, that you can be an Arab, you can be a Muslim, and be not against Israel. This is something new. This is a concept, but the majority of Israeli Arab are still experimenting with it, are still examining their position toward the concept of being a non-anti-Israeli Arab. The fact that the UAE is a very wealthy country, is an inspiration, is a role model for many Muslims around the world, plays a fact here. If we would be able to give the UAE the position of a relative superpower, this without by the way, the inevitable outcome would be many Israeli Arabs, specifically Bedouins from the south, who will take place and assume positions in this new administration, because local Gazans will not be trustworthy enough for this position. There will be many positions open and available for Israeli Arabs and Bedouin for the south to take part in governing the civil society that will remain in Gaza. So without a doubt, implementing the UAE is an idea that is worth thinking about.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ziv Maor, and thank you to our viewers. Don't forget to subscribe to all our channels on YouTube, Telegram, Facebook, WhatsApp, and Twitter. Shalom.